The land sat at the edge of town, flat and wide, framed by oak trees whose branches had seen more than 100 years of history. On the surface, it looked like the perfect place for a new neighborhood. Fresh sidewalks cut through empty stretches of grass. Wooden beams marked the beginnings of houses. Families drove by, picturing futures in homes that weren't even built yet. It all seemed so simple. Land, homes, community. But underneath the soil, deeper than the cement foundations and utility lines, there were secrets that no one in the Homeowners Association wanted to hear about. The neighborhood was supposed to be a dream. A clean, well-planned community of 156 homes, filled with young couples chasing stability and parents eager to watch their children grow in quiet cul-de-sacs. The HOA spoke about safety, order, and a sense of belonging, as if those values could be laid into the very bricks and roofs. On brochures, the homes were painted golden by the setting sun. The lawns were always green. The message was clear: move here and life would be perfect. But the land wasn't empty when they found it. Not truly. It belonged to a family whose connection to it stretched back generations. Long before the HOA's developers laid down blueprints, before the salesmen opened their folders and their smooth voices painted pictures of community, there was one man who carried the weight of that soil on his shoulders. He was not rich. He didn't hold influence in boardrooms. He didn't wear polished shoes or shake hands with investors. But the ground beneath his feet was his, and it had been his family's for 100 years. The man was quiet, almost invisible in town, but his story was not. His great-grandfather had bought the land with sweat, years after the Civil War, when black families rarely had the chance to own property. It wasn't much then, just stretches of farmland under a harsh southern sun. But for his family, it was a promise, a kind of independence that was fragile but real. Through generations, they had fought to keep it safe. Even when money was scarce, even when drought turned the soil to dust, even when offers came from men who believed land should always belong to those with lighter skin and deeper pockets, the family held on. For years, the land stayed quiet. People drove past without noticing, without thinking about who it belonged to. The man lived simply, growing vegetables, keeping his small house neat, and waving to neighbors who never asked him much about his life. He wasn't the type to demand attention. Yet behind his calm eyes lived the memory of every story his father and grandfather had told him. Stories about how they had been cheated, threatened, and ignored, but never defeated. By the time developers came knocking, the town was changing. Young families were arriving from bigger cities, looking for calmer streets and cheaper mortgages. The HOA was born out of this hunger. Their leaders wore suits and spoke of order, fairness, and rules. They presented themselves as guardians of property value, as if money alone could measure the worth of a community. They walked the land with confidence, maps spread out, pointing to where roads should go, where playgrounds would sit, where profits would rise. To them, the land was an opportunity. To the man, it was blood. When the HOA approached, they did not see him as a man with history. They saw him as an obstacle. They spoke in contracts, deadlines, and numbers. He spoke in memories, family names, and roots. They wanted to buy. He wanted to hold. But power has its own way of bending reality. What began as an offer soon became pressure, and what began as pressure soon became something darker. On the surface, the story of this neighborhood looked like progress. New homes, safe streets, smiling families. But underneath, it was built on tension, on a kind of theft dressed in clean papers and stamped signatures. Few of the new homeowners would ever ask what came before their purchase. Few of them would feel the unease that lingered in the silence of their yards at night. But the truth was already buried, waiting, patient. The man's family had lived with struggle for generations. They had also lived with foresight. Buried in that land was more than just memory. There was something planted, something old, something meant to outlive threats and tricks, something the HOA, with all its confidence and pride, would never expect. The town didn't know it yet, but the foundations of those 156 homes weren't as strong as they seemed. Every brick, every wooden frame, every poured driveway sat on top of a story that had been waiting for its turn to be told. And when that story surfaced, it wouldn't just shake the land, it would shatter the perfect world the HOA promised to build. The neighborhood's beginning felt calm, almost ordinary. Families moved in, grass was planted, and children laughed in backyards. But the ground remembered, and so did the man. The trouble didn't come all at once. At first it was whispers, the kind of small-town talk that grows quietly in corners. Neighbors speculated about the old man on the edge of the development, the one who still lived on a stretch of land that the HOA claimed as part of its territory. Some said he was bitter, refusing to sell out of pride. Others painted him as stubborn, selfish even, standing in the way of progress. Few saw him for what he was, a man guarding more than property, guarding the last piece of his family's soul. The HOA board grew restless. Their meetings, once filled with cheerful talk of budgets and landscaping, became sharp with irritation. Each delay, each question about zoning, each hiccup in construction circled back to one problem: him. They had built 156 homes on what they claimed was theirs, yet a portion of land still slipped through their fingers, a piece that made their plans look incomplete. The president of the HOA, a man who prided himself on control, could hardly stand it. Every time he drove through the neighborhood and saw that small, weathered house with its porch light glowing faintly, it felt like defiance staring back at him. The man himself rarely spoke of the HOA. He kept to his routines, watering the garden in the mornings, sitting on his porch in the evenings, walking the land as though memorizing every inch. But inside he felt the noose tightening. Letters arrived in his mailbox, written in stiff, legal language. Calls came late at night, polite but persistent. Even visitors, representatives in pressed shirts who knocked on his door with fake smiles, kept reminding him of deadlines. The message was clear: sell or be forced out. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about power. The HOA had promised new homeowners a flawless community, and the presence of one man standing outside their control threatened that illusion. Every delay meant money lost, and money lost meant anger brewing among investors. The board began to paint him as unreasonable, a problem to be solved rather than a human being. At the same time, the families who had moved in began to feel a strange unease. Some noticed how their children complained about nightmares in the new houses. Others whispered about odd sounds at night, creaks, whispers, even laughter that didn't belong. But most dismissed it. After all, new homes settle, strange noises happen. People pushed down their unease, not knowing that it wasn't just wood and nails shifting above the soil. Something else was stirring, something older than the foundations. Behind closed doors, the man wrestled with his anger. He thought about his father, who had once stood on the same porch and told him, "Never let them take it. This land remembers us." Those words echoed louder as the pressure mounted. He thought of his grandfather, who had worked the soil with his bare hands, who had faced threats of fire and gunshots, but still managed to keep the deed safe in a tin box under the bed. The man carried that weight, and with it came a fear that he might be the one to finally fail. But fear was not the only thing inside him. There was also resolve, sharpened by years of watching others like him be erased. He knew the HOA didn't care about history, about bloodlines, about the sweat of generations. They only cared about control. And what they didn't realize was that his family had never trusted control to outsiders. They had made their own. They had planned for this. The first cracks in the neighborhood's perfect image appeared quietly. A homeowner's dog vanished from a fenced yard, leaving no trace. A newly built driveway collapsed slightly, though engineers insisted it was a mistake in the pour. One child came home from the cul-de-sac shaking, saying she saw a shadow standing by the trees where no one lived. These incidents were brushed off, but unease grew. Inside the HOA meetings, tempers flared. The president snapped at board members, accusing them of incompetence. The treasurer worried about lawsuits. A few suggested making peace with the man, offering him a more generous payout. But pride held the president back. To him, backing down meant weakness, and weakness meant losing everything. So the pressure intensified. Threats of legal action escalated. Rumors were spread through the neighborhood about the man being unstable, dangerous, and unfit to hold such land. The man heard every word, though none of it showed on his face. He kept his silence, but silence didn't mean surrender. Late at night, he walked the fields alone, whispering prayers taught by his grandmother, the kind that weren't written in any book, but carried the weight of a century of survival. He touched the soil with his hands, as if reminding it of who it belonged to, and the soil, in its own way, seemed to answer. By now the tension was more than financial. It was personal. The president of the HOA began driving past the man's house late at night, headlights flashing across the windows, a subtle reminder that he was being watched. Some families reported seeing the man standing in his yard, unmoving, long after midnight, as if guarding something unseen. Fear and resentment twisted together, poisoning the air of the neighborhood. Hidden agendas came to light. One board member, it turned out, had debts that the HOA development was supposed to cover. Another was secretly skimming from the project budget. The cracks widened, and distrust spread even within the board itself. Yet their anger toward the man was the one thing that united them. He became their scapegoat, the figure they could blame for all their failures. Inside the man's home, the past grew louder. Old diaries were pulled from boxes, brittle pages carrying warnings. His grandmother had once written of curses, of promises made under moonlight to protect the family's land. His father's notes spoke of traps laid not in steel or wood, but in the very earth itself. The man felt the pull of those words like a heartbeat under the soil. He was no longer just a man holding land. He was a gatekeeper of something much larger. The breaking point drew closer when the HOA filed papers to seize his land under eminent domain. It was the final insult, stripping away even the pretense of negotiation. To them, it was a lequay, egal victory. To him, it was war. The neighborhood's unease deepened. Families reported cracks forming in walls that had been freshly painted. Children spoke of voices in their bedrooms. Some neighbors avoided walking near the man's property altogether, saying it felt colder there, as if the air itself was heavy. The HOA dismissed these concerns as paranoia, but the homeowners couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the surface was stirring, restless and angry. The man, meanwhile, stopped hiding his defiance. He stood taller, his eyes harder. He began telling anyone who asked that the land wasn't theirs to take, that it had been protected for generations, that anyone who tried would face consequences they couldn't imagine. His words spread like wildfire, feeding both fear and fascination. To some, he was a stubborn old man refusing to let go of the past. To others, he was the last link to a story the neighborhood didn't want to hear. And all the while, the land itself seemed to hum with tension. The HOA thought they were fighting a man. They didn't understand they were fighting a history that refused to die, a trap set long before they laid their foundations. The pressure mounted from every side, financial, social, personal, and with it came cracks that no contract or board meeting could repair. The stage was no longer calm. The air itself seemed to wait, heavy with the sense that something irreversible was about to unfold. The night it happened, the neighborhood was still. The kind of stillness that feels wrong, as if the air itself is waiting. The houses stood lined in neat rows, their porch lights glowing, their blinds drawn, their families tucked in bed. But on the far edge of the development, where the man's land touched the new foundations, There was movement. Cars slowed, headlights dimmed, and voices carried low. The HOA board had gathered, though they didn't call it that. They told themselves it was just business, just another step to secure what was already theirs. In truth, it was something closer to desperation. The president led the way, his face set in stone. He carried the papers, legal documents, eviction notices, everything meant to make this final. But behind the paperwork was anger, sharp and boiling. He couldn't stand the thought of this man, this single holdout, making him look weak. Every delay had cost money. Every day had chipped away at his image of control. Tonight, he wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to the end of it. The man was already waiting. His porch light glowed faintly, casting shadows across the wooden boards. He sat in his chair, unmoving, as if he had known they would come. When the cars pulled up, he didn't flinch. He watched them walk closer, their shoes crunching against gravel, their voices tight with authority. "Time's up," the president said, his voice steady but edged with rage. He waved the papers like a weapon. "This land is no longer yours. You can leave peacefully, or we'll make you leave." The man didn't answer at first. He let the silence stretch, the night swallowing every word. His eyes lifted past the men, past their polished shoes and stiff suits, to the fields behind them. He could feel it. The we right under the soil. The trap his family had whispered about for decades. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. Once he acted, there would be no turning back. Finally, he stood. His voice was calm. Too calm for the moment. "This land doesn't belong to you. It never will. You should have stayed away." Something in the way he spoke sent a ripple through the group. One of the board members shifted uneasily, but the president only stepped closer, fury rising. He reached out as if to shove the man aside, as if physical force could erase 100 years of history. That was the moment the air changed. The ground trembled. At first it was subtle, like the earth shifting after a long day of heat. But within seconds, the tremor grew. Fences rattled. Windows in nearby houses shook. The men stumbled, their balance stolen, and then came the sound, low, guttural, almost human, rising from beneath the soil. The trap had been sprung. The earth cracked open in jagged lines across the man's land. The neat gravel path split in two. Boards from unfinished fences collapsed into the dark. The men shouted, stumbling backward, but the man stood firm, his eyes steady. He had known this was waiting. His family had promised it would protect them if the land was ever stolen. One of the board members screamed as the ground gave way beneath his feet, pulling him down into a sinkhole that hadn't been there seconds before. Another clung to a fence post, his face pale, shouting for help as the soil crumbled under him. The president staggered, his papers flying into the night air like useless confetti. His voice cracked between rage and fear. "What have you done?" The man didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The screams rose, mixing with the groan of breaking earth. Families awoke in nearby houses, rushing to their windows, their faces pale in the glow of porch lights. They saw shadows moving, men shouting, ground splitting open like a wound. Some called for help, others pulled their children away, whispering prayers. No one dared run outside. The president tried to grab the man, to drag him down in his fury, but the earth betrayed him. His foot sank into the soil deeper than it should, pulling him down. He fought, clawing at the dirt, his face twisted in desperation. For a moment his eyes locked with the man's. There was no pity there, no forgiveness, only a quiet, tired certainty. The president's scream cut through the night as he was swallowed whole. Silence fell almost as suddenly as the chaos had begun. The ground sealed itself with a dull shudder, leaving only torn earth and scattered debris. The night was thick with the smell of soil, sharp and damp. The board members who had survived scrambled away, their suits ripped, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. They didn't look back. The man lowered, himself back into his chair, his hands trembling now that it was done. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He felt no triumph, only the weight of what his family had passed down to him. The trap had been set for over a century, and he had unleashed it. Inside the houses, panic spread. Phones lit up as neighbors called each other, voices overlapping in fear. No one knew what had just happened, only that the ground had opened and men had screamed, and then it was quiet again. Some whispered about curses, others swore it was an earthquake. But deep down, every one of them felt the truth. Something unnatural had happened. The HOA survivors tried to gather themselves. Some spoke of burying the story, of blaming faulty construction or natural disaster. But their voices shook, their eyes wide, their words empty. They knew no excuse would cover what they had seen. The man sat alone, staring into the night. His heart ached with loss, not for the men themselves, but for the price of keeping his family's promise. He had protected the land, but at what cost? He thought of his father's voice, his grandmother's prayers, the diaries filled with warnings. They had all led here, to this night, to this act. He had done what they asked of him, and yet his soul felt heavy. The soil was quiet again, but it wasn't over. The screams still hung in the air, trapped in the memories of everyone who had heard them. The neighborhood would never be the same. The perfect world the HOA had promised was shattered, replaced by fear, suspicion, and whispers in the dark. And though the land was his again, the man knew it had taken more than the HOA ever could. It had taken lives, it had taken peace, and it had taken the last piece of innocence he had left. Morning came heavy, as though the town itself was trying to shake off the night but couldn't. The houses looked the same, neat driveways, trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing in their rows, but inside them, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Families whispered over breakfast, children sat quietly at the table, and eyes darted toward the man's land at the edge of the development. What they had heard, what they thought they had seen, clung to them like damp air. The HOA board was shattered. The few who survived carried the night with them like a stain. One man couldn't stop shaking. He woke in the middle of the night, hearing the sound of the earth tearing open, his body drenched in sweat. Another drowned himself in paperwork, trying to twist the narrative into something clean. "It was an accident," he muttered to anyone who would listen. A sinkhole, nothing more. But his voice lacked conviction, his eyes giving him away. The president was gone, swallowed whole, and his absence left a vacuum. Some called it justice, others called it a tragedy. In town, rumors spread faster than the truth. The newspapers wrote cautiously, "Construction mishap claims HOA president," careful not to step into anything they couldn't prove. But neighbors whispered louder, their words soaked in fear. "The old man did something. That land was cursed. I saw it. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Children repeated what their parents tried not to say, and soon the story grew bigger than fact. The man himself became a figure both feared and pitied. Some avoided driving past his home altogether, unwilling to meet his steady gaze. Others came to him quietly, almost respectfully, to ask what had really happened. He never gave them answers. He kept to his porch, to his soil, his silence. Inside, though, he carried a storm. He had done what his family had always warned him he might one day have to do, but carrying the weight of their legacy did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief. At night, he thought of the screams. He saw the faces of men as they were pulled into the earth, their pride and anger stripped away in raw terror. He told himself it was them or him, that the land had to be protected. that his family's sacrifice had meant something. But his chest tightened with doubt. Did survival always demand blood? Was the land safer now, or simply more haunted? The families in the neighborhood struggled with their own shadows. Some couldn't sleep in their new homes. They spoke of strange noises, of walls that seemed to creak with voices instead of wood. A few packed up and left, selling their houses at a loss, desperate to put distance between themselves and the story growing darker with every retelling. Those who stayed lived with unease, pretending to neighbors that everything was fine while drawing their curtains tight at night. The surviving board members tried to repair their reputations, but whispers followed them everywhere. Some in town accused them of greed, of trying to force a man off his rightful land until it killed them. Others pitied them, saying no one could have predicted such a thing. But no matter the perspective, the sheen of authority they once held was gone. They were men marked by failure, their names tied forever to the night the earth opened and swallowed their leader whole. Legal questions surfaced but went nowhere. Lawyers discussed liability, insurance claims, and property values. Yet in the end, there was no clean answer. The land was unstable, they said. A geological fluke, maybe. Something unavoidable. No one dared suggest in court what neighbors whispered in kitchens, that the man's family had left more than memories in that soil. Without proof, the case collapsed, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a deeper divide between the community and the man who lived on the edge of it. The man's family history, once invisible, became impossible to ignore. Old stories resurfaced about his great-grandfather buying the land, about threats and struggles that had nearly stolen it away long before. Some townsfolk began to speak of him with reverence, as if he were a guardian of something sacred. Others branded him dangerous, a man tied to forces better left alone. He became less a person and more a symbol, a figure that carried either respect or fear, depending on who was speaking. Through it all, the man carried his solitude. His hands still touched the soil, his feet still walked the same paths, but his mind was never free. He thought often of his grandmother's words, of promises and traps, of protection that came with a price. The land was his, but it was not at peace. Every night he sat in his chair, the porch light casting its small circle, and waited as though he knew the story wasn't finished. The ripples stretched beyond the neighborhood. Real estate agents struggled to sell the remaining homes, stumbling over words when potential buyers asked about the accident. Some investors pulled out entirely, afraid of bad press. The dream of a perfect, safe community was broken, its image forever scarred. And though the HOA tried to rebuild its reputation, there was no fixing what had been lost. For the families of the men who vanished, grief settled heavily. Wives sat at kitchen tables staring at empty chairs. Children asked questions their mothers couldn't answer. Some clung to the official explanation, telling themselves it had been an act of nature. Others cursed the man, blaming him for everything. In their pain, truth and rumor blurred, until it didn't matter anymore. The town itself changed in subtle ways. Conversations grew shorter, smiles thinner, trust weaker. Where there had once been the promise of a thriving neighborhood, there was now a wound, one that refused to heal. People lowered their voices when they spoke of it, but silence did not erase the fear. The land had a memory, and now the people did too. The man remained, quiet as ever, but no longer unseen. He was the last shadow at the edge of a neighborhood built on broken promises. To some, he was a survivor. To others, a curse. To himself, he was simply tired, carrying the weight of a family's century-old vow and the screams of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The world moved on, but not completely. The houses still stood, children still played in the cul-de-sacs, and lawns were still mowed. But underneath the surface, everyone carried it. The night the ground opened, the night the HOA discovered the trap that had been waiting for them all along.